I tested every compact and point and shoot camera to find the best ones, and I realized the best compact and point and shoot cameras all have a few features in common, but you might not need all these features because the right camera for one person is going to be completely different for someone else. So in this video, I'm going to show you which specific features you need in your camera based on your shooting style and subject matter. So lately, every camera has pretty decent quality, but some cameras are more complicated to use than others. And the smallest, lightest, and easiest to use cameras out there right now are the Sony ZV-1 Mark I and the Mark II. And the two cameras are pretty similar, but they have one major difference that completely changes who they're for. Also, if you want the best pricing on your cameras, make sure to check out the links in the description down below. So when it comes to the ZV-1 Mark I and the ZV-1 Mark II, both cameras are small enough to fit in your pocket or purse, and they're actually smaller than your smartphone. They have a single button to swap between photo, video, and slow motion, alongside a sided articulating screen and an audio input jack. One really cool thing is that the flip out screen is actually touch enabled, pretty similar to a smartphone, so you can just use your fingers to navigate menus and even control the autofocus tracking. And on top of that, both cameras have a really solid onboard microphone, so you don't have to buy an external microphone if you don't want to. And there's a one-click button to give you a cinematic blurry background with just one click, and this is a really hard look to get on a compact camera. Now, both ZV-1 cameras have a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, which I promise blows any Samsung or iPhone sensor out of the water. But there is one major difference between the ZV-1 Mark I and the ZV-1 Mark II. The ZV Mark I has a 24 to 70mm lens with a wide aperture of f1.8 to f2.8, which is the perfect lens for lifestyle shooters, people that just want to get casual photos throughout their day. It allows you to get both a wide shot and a zoom shot all in one lens, and because it has a wide aperture, the ZV-1 Mark I is incredible in low light simply because of that lens. But the ZV-1 Mark II has an 18 to 50mm lens, which is better for vloggers and people who want to be able to show more of the environment around them while shooting, but it doesn't zoom nearly as far because this has a 50mm zoom, whereas the ZV-1 Mark I has a 70mm zoom. So you really have to decide, do you want a wider lens or a lens that can zoom in further? But there's still a pretty big difference in how these cameras record photos and videos, mainly because the ZV-1 Mark II is a newer camera. Both the ZV-1 and Mark II both shoot photos at 24 frames per second, which is as fast as video, so you're never going to miss your shot. And on top of that, the autofocus is tack sharp. It catches focus every single time. However, the ZV-1 Mark II, being newer, doesn't have blackout screens when shooting. This gives you a more fluid motion in your photos, and also this way, because there's no blackout screen, you're having a better time tracking your subject while shooting. But both cameras are really good for action and street photography if that's your style. Like I said before, the autofocus in both of the cameras is phenomenal, but the ZV-1 Mark II has a substantially faster autofocus simply because now there's a dedicated processor on the sensor simply for faster processing of the autofocus. Both cameras shoot 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second with full HD up to 120 frames per second for slow motion options. You pretty much get everything you could possibly need in terms of video frame rates from both cameras. But one thing to note is that both cameras only have 8-bit color, so it is harder to manipulate and manage your colors if you're planning on creating some kind of cinematic look. But the ZV-1 Mark II actually has something known as cinematic vlog mode that automatically puts black bars at the top of your camera, and on top of that, it also gives you a cool cinematic filter to apply to your footage, and this way you can save yourself a lot of time and hassle. So the Mark II is a better choice for someone who doesn't want to deal with the hassle of editing their videos later on, but both cameras also have cinema profiles built in like S-Log2, S-Log3, and Cinema Profile 1 and 4. This way you can create a cinematic look later on with your videos, but again, it is only 8-bit color. So the difference really comes down to the lens and the cinematic vlog mode. If you're a lifestyle shooter that wants a wide shot and a zoom shot all in one lens, and you also want your camera to be good in low light, the Mark I is the obvious choice. But if you're someone that doesn't want to process your footage to get the cinematic look, maybe you just want it in camera, the Mark II is a much better choice. However, for some of you guys, you may want a small and compact camera, but the 20 megapixel sensor may not be enough resolution for you, and you maybe even want a larger sensor even if you're just shooting casual photos. And for you guys, I have a camera that's still pretty small, but has an amazing sensor, and it's better than any compact camera out there. and I promise it's going to blow your mind. And that is the Canon M6 Mark II. The M6 Mark II, despite being such a powerful camera, is surprisingly small and compact, even with the additional lens on top. And one really cool thing about this lens is, like most compact cameras, the lens is actually not physically attached to the camera, so you can change up your lenses. And on top of that, the button layout is much more ergonomically friendly with two separate command dials for shutter, aperture, or ISO, with a much bigger grip. In your hand, this camera really feels more like a proper mirrorless camera without the bulk and heft of a bigger camera. And the flip screen actually comes up to the top instead of the side, which you may or may not like, but with a top flip up screen, it does make it harder to attach an external microphone. However, surprisingly enough, the internal audio in the M6 Mark II is pretty decent and good enough for most casual users. But it does have an input for an external microphone if you want to use one. Now, the M6 Mark II is definitely not small enough to fit into your pocket, but it works really well with a shoulder strap or hand strap, and you can easily carry this camera around all day without any problems. This camera uses the older Canon M mount lenses, which are really cheap to buy used, and you can even use the professional Canon L series lenses on this camera with an adapter. And there's a lot of compact primes that you can get for the M6 Mark II that keep your camera super small. But what's inside the M6 Mark II is really going to blow your mind, because it has the same sensor that you find in the very popular Canon R7, Canon 90D, which is a 32 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is much larger than the 1-inch sensor found in the ZV-1 Mark I and most small compact cameras. With a 32 megapixel APS-C size sensor, you get the same resolution and look to your photos and videos as you would normally get with a professional and much more expensive camera. So you get 32 megapixel photos with 14-bit RAW, and you can shoot as fast as 14 frames per second. This is a great camera for any sort of action shots or sports photography, and with 14-bit RAW, you get an insane amount of not only resolution, but also the ability to play around with your colors in editing. And with 32 megapixel photos, you can easily crop into your photo without any major loss in visual quality. And with that sensor, the M6 Mark II delivers sharp 4K video up to 30 and 24 frames per second, with also full HD up to 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion, making it the perfect handheld video camera for someone that's traveling, someone that's shooting stuff on the street. It's basically giving you a powerhouse professional camera in the palm of your hands. But one thing to note, this camera once again has only 8-bit colors, so you really have to rely on the Canon colors in camera. But the Canon colors in camera look amazing. They look very true to life with a hint of warmth, and they especially make skin tone and faces look really good, and everyone on this camera looks really attractive. What makes the M6 Mark II so special is that you get such a tiny camera with so much horsepower that looks as good as a much more expensive pro-level camera. Now, there is one camera that is quite possibly the world's most popular and best-selling compact camera out there, and for that exact reason, it's actually very, very hard to find. But I actually have an alternative for you that comes very, very close to specs and the look of this camera. And that is the Fuji X100V, which is really hard to find. Instead, I recommend buying the Fuji X-T30 Mark II. The Fuji X100V is mainly popular because it's an absolute style icon. This camera looks like magic. The Fuji X-T30 and Fuji X100V are very compact cameras, but the X-T30 is actually slightly less wide and only a hair taller because the viewfinder is at the top. But the button layout on both cameras is exactly the same. Both cameras are made to look like vintage cameras from the 60s and 80s. They have an ISO and shutter dial at the top, and the aperture is actually on the lens itself. However, it does have two command dials, so you can still use it like a regular modern camera if you want to. One major difference between the X100V and the Fuji X-T30 Mark II is that the Fuji X-T30 Mark II has an interchangeable lens mount, whereas the Fuji X100V has a fixed 28mm lens. Both cameras have a tilt screen on the back, though these screens do not flip up to the side or top for you to see yourself. And both cameras have an input for external audio microphone, but the internal audio on both cameras is pretty meh. Now, both cameras have the exact same 26 megapixel X-Trans4 sensor, so the quality from the two cameras is exactly the same. And they both have Fujifilm emulations built right in, which is what Fuji cameras are known for, so you get the cinematic filmic look right in camera without any editing. And without a doubt, on this list, the Fuji cameras have the best colors. But there is a slight difference in terms of specs and features between the two cameras. The Fuji X100V shoots at 11 frames per second in photo mode, and the XT-30 is slightly slower at 8 frames per second. However, the XT-30 Mark II does have slightly faster autofocus. In terms of video, both cameras shoot 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, and both cameras also shoot 2K up to 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion. However, the Fuji X100V does shoot 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion, which is a killer feature to have, but not everyone needs it. And both cameras only have 8-bit color when it comes to video. Personally, I think that's totally fine because Fuji cameras are really meant to be used with the in-camera film emulations. I personally prefer the XT-30 Mark II for the interchangeable lens mount, and I can easily pair it with the Fuji 27mm lens for a very similar look and size to the X100V, plus this camera is cheaper and easier to find. But if you do want the absolute best deals on your camera, and the Fuji X100V does come into stock every now and then, make sure to check out the links in the description down below for the best pricing on your camera, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.